Hello, everybody, and welcome to this webinar brought to you by Anthrolytics and Twilio. My name is Peter Dorrington, and I'm delighted today to be joined by Sam Richardson of Twilio. Hi, Sam.
Hi. Thank you for having me, Peter. It's really good to be here to discuss this very hot topic at the moment.
It certainly is hot, I'll grant you that. I've had so many people contact me about this subject over the last few weeks. So what we're going to do is, in a moment, Sam and I are going to share some of our thoughts and experiences about the challenges that we face in acquiring, motivating, and retaining staff, particularly in contact centres. But it has applicability elsewhere, and we're going to talk about things that motivate staff and how we keep them engaged. Now, we're going to present for a few minutes, and then we're going to have a fireside conversation. So we'll come off slide share and we'll actually do a bit of a head-to-head. Now, we're more than happy to take questions, but what we're going to do at the end is also share some examples with you of where this may apply, and also what you can do to follow up with any questions that you might have that you don't want to ask today. So to start then, I'm going to actually start with the presentations. So what I'd like to do is just talk you through a couple of the points. So firstly, what do I mean by employee engagement, employee motivation, or the employee experience? Well, one thing is absolutely the case, that what motivates people as employees has certainly changed over the last few years, and definitely since we saw work by people like Maslow with the hierarchy of needs and Heisenberg's Herzberg's two-factor theory of employment. They were for a different age. Now we live in an point where it's not just some of those easy to think of factors that stimulate people to do their best work for you. Now, one of the things I'm convinced about is that overall employee experience starts before their first day of employment. It's about their expectations and aspirations, how you manifest that as an employer, and how that translates into what happens during their employment and even afterwards. So if you've ever been a victim of those rather poor Glassdoor reviews, offboarding is perhaps almost as important as effective onboarding. But what I'm going to talk about, and then Sam and I will discuss, is that what motivates employees, what drives the behaviours that we want to or don't want to see, is a whole range of things. Some of them are internal and some of them are external, and some of them are under our control and some of them aren't. But I want to talk about that in the context of where we find ourselves today, with a workforce that may be working remote or hybrid, or parts of teams which are now global or regional. But one thing is true. A lot of the workforce today feel disconnected from their employers and disconnected from their colleagues. So their experience very much is very different from when I entered the workforce. And there I expected to have a long-term career with one employer. I built up a lot of my friends and network. We all talk about how important it is about not what you know, but who you know. Well, that's definitely changed. And all the research is clear on this, that employees at the moment are feeling less well supported. They're definitely less happy. They're being challenged by new things, so they're more anxious and uncertain about what's going on in the world and what that means for them. We're having to do well-being calls and we're scheduling those. Now, that itself is debatable about the utility of that, but we do actually have to find ways of managing this workforce when perhaps management by walking around isn't really the option it used to be. And the problem that we have as employers is that our employees are getting more difficult to recruit people with the right mindset in the first place, but also keeping them motivated in this new world of work and avoiding that unplanned attrition when they decide that they've had enough and that they want to leave. Now, one way of countering this is to display empathy. So what I'd like to do is talk briefly about what do I mean by empathy. Well, that in itself has three main characteristics or components. We can summarize it by saying it's walking a mile in somebody else's shoes. That is, being able to feel what somebody else may feel as if you were in their position. And the three components are, firstly, cognitive empathy. That is understanding what other people feel, what our employees feel, and why they feel it. Now, in human beings, that might generate emotional empathy. That is, I feel some of those feelings myself. I can imagine what it is like to be you. And as a result of that, I might want to do something about those feelings. Or as a result of knowing how you feel, I might want to take an action. And that's compassion or affective empathy. Now, if we have cognitive empathy, that's understanding how people feel, but we don't do anything about it, that's not true empathy. That's an academic exercise. So what I want to do today on my piece is talk about, well, how do we get that understanding about how people feel and what they're likely to do about that? And what should we do about that as employers in order to help maintain motivation, keep people productive and happy and in a good frame of mind so that we don't lose people and we build a reputation as being the employer of choice. And one thing I'm sure that Sam is going to touch upon is the absolute need for communications. It is impossible to establish rapport without communications. But in the modern world in which we live, all too often that means spamming, or we just have those really mistimed or mistargeted communications. So it's not just any old communications, it's timely and targeted. But how do people make decisions? And how do employees come to these decisions about what they're going to do and whether they're going to give you discretionary effort and so on? Well, there's a couple of things I want to briefly talk about. The first of which is that head picture. What are the factors that go into the decisions that lie behind the behavior? Now, the neuroscience is very clear that all decisions have an emotional component as well as a rational one. There are things that we need, those are the rational things, and we often think about those from an employer's point of view. But then there are the things that we want, and those are the emotional things. You know, I want to feel more happy. I want to be less afraid. I want to be more confident about the future. So that dimension is pretty clearly understood, as is the influence of other people. We're social animals. We like to see what the rest of the herd is doing, and that often guides our behavior. There's also, of course, the context. Where am I today? What's going on in the world? What is it that I need to do or I'm trying to do? And I'll just talk on one other factor before I come to the one that was actually quite difficult to solve. How we use these insights. So I talk a lot about the internal biases, and these fall into two camps. We've got the heuristics, the rules of thumb that we've learned through our experiences or through social teaching. These are the things that generally seem to work, and we can therefore take a shortcut in our thinking. We don't have to constantly reevaluate. And then we've got the cognitive biases. Now, this is where we think we're being clever, but really we're not. And if you've ever left the house and ended up buying two of something you hadn't intended to buy one of in the first place, that's often as a result of a cognitive bias associated with a perception of value, rather than the cost of money that you've just spent. But the one that is really difficult is history. How did every employee get to the point where they are right now? Because that informs our expectations as employees, what we think is going to happen, what we want to happen as a result of our experience. Now, on the right-hand side is a little diagram, which is really a 4-box model, 2x2. What is it that I want for myself rationally and psychologically or emotionally? And what is it that I expect from you as an employer? Now, I'm going to touch on this later on very briefly because it's the core of a new white paper that we're developing right now about the psychology of employment. So what are the motivating factors and so on? But I do want to do just a little brief bit about the journey of employment, because it isn't just, as I say, when I turn up and going through annual reviews. As each individual employee has their journey with you as an employer, there are moments that influence the way that they feel. I call those moments that matter, the things that have emotional weight, so enough significance that they cause us to feel something about them. And they're not continuous. So they're not the same all the way through your employment. So obviously, as I'm beginning to think about joining, I might be excited and anticipating that. And, I'm really happy I'm going to get a new job. And then onboarding, the experience can be really good. And I feel more confident. And I'm getting some sense that I can predict how it's going to go. And then as I'm enabled, my productivity goes up. I get more settled in the role. I'm delivering a better customer experience. But then I might have a misstep. So something doesn't go the way that I think. And that begins to generate some negative emotions. And if those continue, or if they're big enough, they might then result in me doing something like resigning. So all of these moments that matter have emotional associations with them, and those are detectable. And because they're detectable, they can also be predictive. So we don't have to wait until somebody hands in their notice to realize that they might be in danger of churning. They may be thinking about a different kind of job. So how does it work in practice? It's a two-step process. The first of which is using the tools that you've already got and the communications that you have to understand what is important to employees. Now, to be fair, they rarely tell you what that is, completely frankly. Even in the best employee engagement surveys, you rarely see answers like, well, I don't trust my boss. I don't see myself having a future here. You know, I don't think the company strategy is what I want to be, or I don't believe in the values. So even anonymous surveys, people can be a bit reserved about what they say. However, there are things where they are in a forum and they're talking openly and they're talking about their experiences of work and how their day has gone, that they're not so sensitive that we're observing that, but from that we can identify what's important to them and how they feel about those things, and then how that contributes to a decision to act. Like I take on more work or more responsibility, or I actually begin to withdraw from the company and I offer less effort. So calibration is about understanding what is it that people care about. And then in operations, what we're doing is making predictions. So we're saying, Peter's at the point now where he is sufficiently angry and afraid and uncertain about the future that he may well be thinking about changing a job. He's not done anything about that at this point, so now might be the ideal time to intervene. And before it becomes a acute problem, we can deal with it whilst it's at the chronic stage. So we might be able to do something that helps Peter feel more valued, engaged, and motivated. So on the one hand, we have to figure out what's important. And on the other hand, we have to look for signifiers of those in the operational data or the workforce data to say, this may be where Peter's head's at right now. And what's changed over the last few years is that we can do that at scale. So whether you have 10 employees or 10,000 or 10 million, you can actually do that on a regular basis. And it does solve one of those problems about how do I manage a remote or hybrid workforce when I can't be there all of the time. In practice, it works like this. So once we've figured out what's important, then we take data from the operational systems, as say the ones that employees would expect you to analyze, feed them into the scoring engine, and we come up with a behavioral score. So this is where we think Peter's head is at, or more importantly, where his heart is at. And that might be influencing his behavior, but based upon those insights, we can make some changes into the operational systems. So maybe we do something different on scheduling, or which channel Peter is looking at, or which core reason codes he's going to be dealing with in the short term, with an objective to obviously maintain long-term stability and agility. And that in turn feeds its way back into the systems of record. So we update those records as well as how we think Peter's feeling based upon his day-to-day experiences. Now, the reason we do this is not just because we want to be nice employers, but because the data is very clear and very quantifiable. There is a direct link between employee experience and their ability to deliver good customer experiences. And those good customer experiences can be directly related and quantifiably so to the impact on the bottom line. So this is what I call the economics of empathy. We can actually study these. This becomes quantifiable. So we can see that not only is it the nice thing to do, the ethical thing to do, it's the smart thing to do for business. And we can make some decisions about how do we optimize all of these relationships. Now, one thing that I did say in this webinar is, well, what can we do about those things that demotivate prospective employees or employees? Well, let me share with you some of the factors we found that we're expanding upon based upon our research. So there are lots of motivators at play. All of these are being continuously re-evaluated by employees. So these are things that are influencing how they feel. Now, some of these are very specific, and you'll have come across them before, like giving employees a sense of purpose and mission, so they know that what they do is important and it's making a difference to people. But also that your values mean something at an emotional level. So it's not just something we put on the wall, it's something that actually means something to them. So, for example, what do we mean by do no evil? How do we translate that into something very concrete? And having realistic goals. So this is something very important to people, that give me goals, by all means measure my performance, but make them realistic, make them so that I know what is expected of me, but also that you give me some agency and some autonomy back so that I have the ability to control my performance against those goals. And then you give me the appropriate levels of recognition. So more than an attaboy, but I want to know that, because I'm doing something that is valuable and valued, that's recognized by those that I put my faith and trust in. So getting the recognition as well as part of meaningful feedback. How can I grow? How can I increase my value? Now, for younger employees, this is particularly important. As they grow their careers, they want to know, what is it that I do that is valued? What is it I can do to go on? So empowerment and agency, that's really about having some control. We've talked about that before, as well as being an environment where we can put up with difference, that actually having some diversity of thought is as important as being aligned around specific goals and objectives. And then equal and fair treatment. Do I have equal opportunities to achieve what I can best achieve? And am I giving the same treatment as everybody else? And I put pay and benefits right at the end for a very good reason. When I looked at the research, it's quite clear that although this might be the first value lever we reach for, and it is important, don't get me wrong, very few people want to work for nothing, it's actually often just a hygiene factor. If you get it right, it's the other things that are more important than an increase in pay or salary. Now, I'm just going to hand over to Sam in a moment. But before I do, I just want to tell you that, as I said, I'm working on a white paper at the moment. We're going to be discussing these in depth with the academic citations behind them. So you can go and look at the research if you want to, but we're going to talk about how all of these play together. And in a moment, Sam and I will continue our conversation. But before we do, Sam, I'm going to hand over to you. And if you wouldn't mind telling me a little bit about yourself and Twilio, and then I'd like to get your point of view on this.
Sure, thank you. I've been scribbling loads of notes, even as you talk, Peter. It's just such an interesting topic for me. And why it's an interesting topic is because I've been working in customer management and customer service transformation for about maybe 25 years now. And I think the most common thing that I've tried to impress upon the organizations that I've worked with is that employee experience and customer experience exist in tandem, with a very fine line between the two as to when one stops and the other starts. And listening to your employees as well as listening to your customers is the way to differentiate yourself. I mean, I have to admit, I've had mediocre success at this, Peter, because, as you know, not everybody always takes that on board, but they really should. I think MIT a couple of years ago produced some really interesting research that showed that those organizations that take an employee experience first approach have about a 25% uplift in their revenues. So it matters, to your point, right? There is a bottom line reason as to why people should do this. But first, what's Twilio? And just for those who might not be over familiar with who Twilio is, we kind of take a different approach to the world. So we don't like to give organizations the solution and tell them how to manage their customer engagement, their contact centers, or their data. We like to give our customers the APIs or the building blocks to be able to design their own customer experience and employee experience, because we believe nobody knows an organization better than the people that work within that organization. And we're one of these customers that or organizations that you might not have heard about, but you're probably touching every day in some way, whether it be through food delivery, rideshare, some of the, neobanks, retailers, whether you do your kind of click and collect, an appointment reminder, all of this fits within our platform, which last year had more than 1 trillion human interactions go through it. So not small by any stretch of the imagination. I have the privilege of working in a really interesting team, which really helps our customers think about what they want to build. So once they've got the building bricks, the bigger question really is, okay, well, what is it that we want to do? What do we want to design? And that's what I'll touch on today, because I think it's really important to think about it in light of everything that you've talked about, because once we've got all this fantastic information, how can we then start translating that into real life for our contact centers? So, oh, I'm not sure. I've maybe can just move on. I'm not sure my, there we go. Okay, so to take it into very much today and where we are, you know, we know that we're in this, whether you call it the Great Resignation, the Great Reshuffle, whatever it might be, we're kind of at a crisis point, which I think we all are feeling right now. 20% of people expect to change jobs this year. We hear that a lot. In the UK alone, there are 1.3 million vacancies. And then there's some really interesting, kind of very specific data points to contact centres that I was kind of alarmed to read about. One of which is that nearly 50% of part-time workers report greater financial distress than full-time colleagues. You know, this is really serious, especially in an industry like the one that we work in, specifically around contact centres, where there are so many part-time workers. And linked to that as well, there's huge levels of burnout. So, and one of the drivers of these is unpredictable work schedules. So even though there are so many other factors, as you've identified, with when we look at employee experience, there are some very practical things that are driving some of these factors. To your point, pay not being the top of it. You know, there are many things that we do in our everyday work in contact centres, in customer service and customer-facing industries. They're actually driving this burnout. And I was reading something very pertinently this morning where the Institute of Customer Service has said that they have done a survey and something like 76% of customer-facing staff are facing burnout, or they're saying that they're burnt out at the moment. It's more than 75%. It's huge. And it's that predictability, flexibility, how we engage with customers, how we even run or operate our contact centres or our service environments that are driving agents away, that are driving people away and really exacerbating this problem that we're facing, particularly in the service industries at the moment. And not necessarily pay, you know, even slightly better. We're talking pence is what's making the difference, because it's not the only factor alone. But from crisis, you know, there is always then an opportunity. And I, you know, partly because of the job I do, partly because I've been doing this for 20 something years now, but I really think that we're at this rare moment in time to redesign what our working lives look like, not just in the case of them being flexible or hybrid, how we think about employees, the relationships we have, the communication we have, but how we actually structure our systems and the technology that support us, our workflow. Every element of life can be redesigned. Just in the same way that we would redesign customer journeys or service blueprints, I think we should take exactly the same approach to how we redesign our working lives and take it from that bigger picture, from the start right the way through to how we deliver resolution for customers. And to do that, I think that there are some core design principles that we should really think about when we're taking this opportunity to redesign what in particular contact centres look like today. And the first is around being heard, of course, you know, always the most important. You've touched on it, well, you've spoken about it at great length, and it's so important. It's that communication element. I've worked with countless organisations who neglect to really listen to their employees. What are they telling them? Not just in the survey, but in their everyday lives. I've been working with a really interesting bank lately, and they've done something I think is great, which is they've actually stopped call listening and doing that quality element. And instead, they use it as an opportunity as a group to listen to the process, to listen to the customer experience, and really hear directly back from employees as to what they can do, how can they improve it, what can they do differently. Such a simple thing, but I think it really shows the employee that they're valued, that they're heard, that they're listened to, as well as, you know, it's always been having that autonomy, being able to feedback, being able to have that direct influence over the improvement that you can make in your day-to-day job is so important. And I think that for me is that number one design principle. How can we make sure everything that we're doing ensures that employees are heard? The next is for me making them feel secure. So how can we make employees feel secure in their job? And I'm not talking about whether you'll have a job or not as such, but it's the predictability of your shifts. You know when you're going to work, you've got some control over it. You know that you can trust your managers. You know that there's transparency and visibility. You know that you can communicate in an honest and open way. And there's the technology to be able to do that. Again, if we took this as a design principle when re-looking at our contact centres, this would start to build on that empathy and start to build on that employee experience. And then I think confidence is really key. It's key to growing people. It's key to them doing a good job. When we look at that in your moments that matter, when we look at that working and struggling, those 2 moments in the journey, this is imperative. How do we give people all the skills that they need so they can do their job effectively? How can we do things like use routing to make sure they're answering contacts or queries that they are comfortable in doing? How can we give them all the tools that they need in order to feel confident? Support when things don't go quite right. Use communication tools, use video, use chat, whatever it might be. One of the interesting things that we saw coming out of or during the pandemic is that a lot of the organisations we work with wanted to create almost like their own WhatsApp groups, but in their own platforms, because WhatsApp has proved to be such an incredible tool to keeping that connection going for teams that they wanted to replicate it. And we've seen a huge increase in teams doing that, which I think is a really interesting way to keep that connection alive, to stop that disconnection that you talked about right at the top of your presentation. And then finally, equipped. Giving people the skills to be able to do their job, giving people the data and the information and everything that they need about the customer in order to deliver resolution, which ultimately is what customers really want. It's what employees really want to do, problem solve, is incredibly important. And technology, still, when we visit many contact centres, there are like people with 13 screens open, which should be a thing. It should be a relic, but it isn't a relic. And having that ability to actually simplify all of that and not add complexity to people's jobs, again, is one of those ways to really listen and build up that employee experience. And I think there's just a few points, if we're going to take this opportunity to redesign, I think we have to research, listen, understand the empathy, do exactly what you were talking about, understand what matters most, and create a strategy based on those needs of your employees. Use technology to simplify, don't add complexity. And I think that designing around digital fatigue is something that's come up really recently, but it's very important. So nearly 50% of Gen Z or Gen Z have reported feeling digital fatigue in the last 30 days. Well, that's enormous. And if we're expecting people to work very long shifts using multiple screens, juggle lots of digital elements, especially if working remotely, this is going to have a significant impact into the well-being of employees. Another one is to think about these strategies that make sense, channel strategies that make sense to agents. What are they comfortable with? How can they communicate with customers? What makes sense? And really, the transformation, and I think the era that we're at in the moment is, whilst previously we might have been beholden to solutions, what we have now is the technology to be able to build an experience that's unique to an organisation. Build the employee experience so it complements the customer experience. Make sure that the two are absolutely joined up. Make sure the agent, if we're talking contact centre, has all the information they need about the customer and can talk to them like a human without some of those things that actually drive us mad about customer experience. And once we do that, of course, we'll start to see that improvement in customer experience, because you can't have poor employee experience and good customer experience. As we mentioned multiple times, the two work hand in hand with each other. So I think, sure, we seem to be at this crisis point in our industry at the moment, but I think that we have a much bigger question to answer than perhaps people are thinking, and it's natural. We think about firefighting, but I think what you and I both strongly believe in and say is, actually, let's take a step back. Let's look at this with the empathy lens. Let's really understand our people, our employees, our contact center agents. And we know that the experience needs to look different, but I think the really big question is, what do we want it to look like? And that, for me, in amongst all of the firefighting that's happening at the moment, is the question that people should really be looking at, how can we make this different and take this opportunity to really use these new tools that are at our disposal to be able to do that.
Thanks very much for that, Sam. You've raised a whole series of interesting questions there, and I'm going to take a couple of them. And I do like this point about digital fatigue. I think I'm going to steal that from you, if you don't mind. But I can recognize it. That's the thing. It's definitely a case there. Anyway, let's just talk about a couple of these things, because let's be honest, a career in call centers probably wasn't first choice for many people. So we've got this hurdle that people think, well, they have perceptions what they think that job's like. I'm not saying that's the reality, but it does come with a perception. So it's always had this chronic problem that it's often seen as low value, low wage work that's very challenging, but it's become acute over the last few years. And I think that it's a sector that's been particularly badly hit by changing in work patterns and things. So I'd just like to explore that with you for a moment. So I'd just like to get your thoughts. Why do you think some of this is? Why has it suddenly become much worse than it was before?
I mean, I think perhaps because power is in the hands of the employee now. I remember starting in the contact centre 25 years ago, and it was actually a pretty good job to have. I had lots of autonomy. We were really valued because the customer experience was very important. As we know, over time, it's become a cost centre increasingly, and so many initiatives that claim that they're customer centric in reality are about reducing costs. And because more people work in a contact centre than anywhere else, because organisations are so siloed, I think the value of what's gone on in that contact centre has been diminished over the years, whether it's been outsourced or the way the customers have been treated or handled. This is a whole topic of its own, right? I think what's really I think there's a couple of things that have brought this to a crisis point, one of which is our environment and the choice and the fact that customers can go anywhere else now and do. And when we have all of that choice, we often say at Twilio that we're in the relationship economy now. And now that we are in the relationship economy, actually, your customer-facing staff are the most important people that you've got, which then brings choice in for customer-centered people too. I think that there's something in the way that we've treated them, with the lack of flexibility, with the lack of autonomy, with the way that we've really, not all, there are some places that do it really well, but in general, I just think that whole numbers-based attitude towards it, again, has driven people to make different choices. The rise of the gig economy is one of them. I think that there's a lot more available now than there ever was before. The rise in the digital economy itself, I know of lots of people that kind of retrained to actually work within the digital economy. So I think that, we're in a time of extreme choice, and for employers, that's almost what's bringing the crisis for them. People don't need to put up with this anymore, right? And I think this can get exacerbated with the disconnection that you talked about, because the thing that used to bond people together was this community, this sense, this turning up every day to see your friends. But if that doesn't exist anymore, then you've just got the truth about what the job really is, then of course you're far more tempted to look elsewhere. So I think there are so many factors that have driven the problems that we've got today. I'm interested in your take. What do you think?
Well, I think that you've certainly mentioned a couple of the big ones there. Like, it's so much easier now to have alternatives. So the cost of switching your job, why would I go to this call center and get shouted at for 8 hours a day for very low pay when I can go and work for a fast food joint and get same money, less stress? I think that's part of it. I also think that because of the nature of the work itself has changed, so we're using a lot more automation than we used to. We think that's a good thing, right? It's taking away some of those mundane tasks from agent. It's making customers, giving them the ability to self-serve. But what's left behind is an environment in which the agent has to work, which is much more complex. They're dealing with unique inquiries because it's the first time you've seen it. Otherwise, you would have automated for it. So they have to be creative problem solvers. So they need new skills as well. And they're not always getting the backup for that, in that they're not given that agency, that autonomy. So I think to your slide earlier, when you were talking about some of the the importance of being heard, a lot of that is absolutely the case. That the agent themselves actually give me some autonomy, but give me the tools in which I can do that, which also means don't measure me in the ways that you used to measure me, because we live in a different world now. So I know that, you know, as I say, for me, a communication might trigger an interaction with an agent. And if the customer's got a problem and it's going to take 8 minutes to solve, it's going to take 8 minutes to solve. If you try to curtail that because you want to hit some average handle time target, that's not actually working in a customer-centric way. The biggest problem, I think, though, is that many managers of my era, or trained in the way that I was trained, are very used to physical presence of teams and working with people where you can see the cues that somebody might be suffering, or somebody's really up and they're buoyant and they're game for it. And that's much harder to do in these remote and hybrid environments where people, their work environment is not some big office with cubicles. It's in a little room in the corner of their house or flat. That's a very different, isolating experience, which has a psychological toll. So I think that, as you know, one thing I believe Hertzberg got right was this idea of hygiene. If we take care of the fundamentals so that people are paid adequately and they're recognized and rewarded appropriately, what's left is whatever that employee needs to be ready, willing, and able to perform the task to their best of ability and to use the technology appropriately. So communications platforms to help streamline some of those interactions, but then hand off seamlessly to the agent, along with the perception of, well, what is it that this customer needs and how best can I serve them without having to put them on hold for 5 minutes whilst I dig around trying to find that answer to the unobvious question that I've been asked. Yeah. Now, let me bring back to the point that you ended on. What do we want the future of the contact center to look like? Because I don't believe it's going to be a hangar with 2,000 people working in cubicles anymore. I think that that's gone, as indeed as many head office functions have gone. But I think the experience is what I'm interested in. So I'd love to know your thoughts about the contact center of the future from an employee experience point of view.
I have the privilege of working with some pretty cutting edge companies around the world. And I've seen some really interesting models. Some of it's around this idea of the boundaryless contact center, which is, it's not those people in a hangar anymore. And sure, this is partly driven by remote working and hybrid working, but it's also about being able to work as a whole organization, so not be siloed anymore. So I think one of the differences in employee experience is going to be the ability to talk seamlessly with what's happening in the front office, be able to, or the store, be able to handle a customer between you just as you would do if they, the same as they've walked into the store, whether they've contacted on the website, whether they've called. I think that channel switching is really interesting, and we're seeing some really interesting ways that companies are kind of handling that and thinking about it in terms of their employee spread. Even some they're not even thinking contact centers at all. They're thinking, actually, what is the best way to route this query to the person in the organization who is best placed to handle it? So really expanding it. So the customer experience becomes everybody's problem again all of a sudden. I think the other thing that's interesting is looking at what some organizations are doing in terms of the way they're restructuring the teams. So they're really adapting more of an agile model. So there's a number of organizations, for example, who are grouped to look at maybe territories or look at a particular customer type. And what they're doing is within their teams, they have a developer and a researcher and an analyst, as well as the customer experience people. And all of them are working together to help improve the customer experience or the employee experience. So I think that that's another trend that we'll see as well. And I think the third one is really driving towards far more flexibility. So being able to handle customer queries while you're on your mobile phone or your handheld device, you know, wherever you may be, that we have customers that are doing, our customers that are doing that now. And again, I think that that's really interesting, really moving it away so that employees can work in a way that fits in with their lifestyle. And I think for me, those are three of the things. It's not finite by any stretch of the imagination, but they're the things that we're seeing most commonly with some of these leading edge organizations.
Thanks, Sam. And I think I'm going to absolutely agree with you on one of those straight away, that a lot of organizations are trying to think of things like customer service journeys, which are much more horizontally aligned. Although, of course, most businesses are set up as silos that vertically. So they actually have a department that does this and another department. But of course, customers don't view organizations like that. They view you as a brand, and they don't care whether your problem is in shipping or manufacturing or having employees there. Right? If we think about all the things that have been going on in airports recently, passengers don't care that it's because you've got bus drivers who are off sick. All they know is they're not getting on their plane and getting to where they want to go to. Well, that's true of almost all organizations. But there is another element, I think, which is, as you say, it's the coordination, because after all, employees are usually customers of somebody else as well. And so their expectations are set of, well, why can't my employment be as digitally enabled and seamless as some of the best customer experiences that I have? Why do I have to be able to, close off or transition this call to somebody else? Why do I have to escalate it beyond my own position? Why don't I have the authority and the backing to do that? And one of the things that's super important is this way of enabling the connection, because as I mentioned at the outset, empathy, whether it's between a customer and the agent, or the agent and their team leader or the manager, is really about connections and rapport. And that does mean having tools that enable us to get a good understanding of how do we think the other person is feeling. That core part of cognitive empathy. Because if I don't know how you're feeling, how can I possibly resolve some of the things that are worrying you or that you're optimistic about if I don't know what they are? But what I want to do now is just think a little bit about, well, what will it take to make that vision a reality? Now, I've mentioned some of the things that I'm really interested in, which is, say, measures of an insight into employee behavior and how they're feeling, as well as how they're performing, and how those two things are linked, and how to connect that from the operational systems and the way that the agent desktop becomes simplified. It's also a source of data that we should be using to get that insight. After all, in most organizations today are software enabled in one form or another, and the digital exhaust of that is lots and lots of data, most of which we don't use effectively, but we could. But I'd like to ask you, what for you is it going to take to turn this now acute problem of we can't attract people into our sector, and when we get them, we struggle to get them to the point of proficiency quickly enough without them becoming burned out, digitally fatigued, and leaving the role. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, Sam.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because all the tools are there to avoid this. It's just that organizations don't use them. And whether it's because they're not geared up to do it, because they take design. So, I'm speaking very much about Twilio now, because we have all the tools to be able to build, let's take it to a very practical level, a contact center agent. There is no need to have multiple screens. You can build it so that everything you need to know about a customer as they dynamically pop through, you can have in front of you with the history, what they've been looking at. At the end, you can put in a sentiment score, and anything that you want is available. But I think the chronic problem is that bravery, that shaking the status quo, doing something different. There is no reason not to transform the way that these organizations work and the structures work. It takes people in leadership to do things differently than they've done it before, to take a step back, to research, to have a curious mind, to really think. It's a terrible overused phrase, thinking out of the box, but it needs a total rethink as to how we think about the employee experience and enable them to do their job in a really effective way. And for me, just as you'd mentioned, it comes down to that customer journey and that employee journey. And when we really understand what those two look like and how they interact with each other, then we should start giving employees and customers the tools to be able to transact in a way they need or fulfill their needs. So for me, it's very simple. It's that, people aren't using what's available. in order to make this better. They could make it better today. Everything's there. I think it just kind of needs, a bit of heads up out of the mire of the day-to-day in order to be able to see it and reimagine and redesign what we do, so it becomes far more geared towards both employee and customer needs. I'm not sure if that answers your question, but I feel quite strongly about this.
No, and I think that that's absolutely fine, because I feel very strongly about this as well. I mean, I'm going to touch on a couple of points there that you made. Firstly, I agree. Almost all the organizations I talk to already have all that they need to make this happen, maybe with a few extra bits and pieces, like the work that you and I do with our respective organizations. But I think that the case is that they often are so busy working hard that not only are they not working smart, they're not working compassionately. And I think that compassion bit, the economics of empathy doesn't come natural to the way that many call centers are managed. They're given SLAs, performance targets, and there's absolutely a place for those. But in the human experience, we're less worried about whether you answer on the 4th or the 5th ring as to what you say when you pick up the phone. So I think that organizations do have the wherewithal to do it, or at least they can get it relatively straightforward. They certainly have all the data that they need. They do need to, as you say, lift their head up a little bit and look around and see, well, is there a better way? Challenge the status quo? So I'm going to violently agree with you on those points. And at that point, we've actually come to a really good point to just perhaps draw it to a close. So all I'm going to do is say, Sam, thank you very much. I've really enjoyed your input. Now, you and I, I'm sure, are going to have lots of conversations in the future. So everybody look out for those. That white paper will come out after the summer about the employee motivations. So keep an eye on that as well. But I want to thank you, Sam. I want to thank Twilio for your support as well. Most of all, I want to thank you for watching. And of course, what I'd like to do is invite you to look out for the next series. We'll probably do one of these a little bit later after the summer. But until then, thank you very much and goodbye. Take care now. Bye-bye.